In the hour before dawn, Cora Ellison knelt on the cold tile of the kitchen, both hands gripping a steel brush as she scraped away burnt grease, her cracked knuckles bleeding onto the very floor she'd been told she would kneel on for the rest of her life. 4 agonizing years. Thousands of dishes cooked from her late husband's recipes, while another man stood in the light and collected the applause. "Scrub it again. There's still a mark." Wade Mercer's voice slammed down from above, a steel tray clattering onto the tile a hand's width from her knee. "This restaurant is failing because of slow, useless things like you." Cora didn't look up. She picked up the tray, set it aside, and kept scrubbing. She had stopped crying the same year she stopped believing justice ever came looking for the poor. Then the front door swung open, carrying in the cold breath of the sea, and Mercer's shouting died mid-sentence, as if a hand had closed around his throat. The man in the gray overcoat, standing in the doorway, was a name the entire South Boston waterfront spoke only in whispers: Ronan Gallagher, King of the Docks. A man, the wind itself, asked permission before blowing through his territory. He had come to collect a debt. What he didn't know was that this kitchen hid another debt, one buried for 4 years beneath a fire the whole city had agreed to call an accident. His gaze swept past the groveling owner and settled on the woman kneeling on the floor with bleeding hands. He didn't look at her the way men looked at a poor widow washing dishes for a living. He looked at her like something valuable that had been thrown away by mistake. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe to our channel, and let's follow this truth all the way to the end. Ronan Gallagher walked into the middle of the restaurant without the slightest haste, moving with the measured pace of a man who had settled everything in his mind long before his hand ever touched the door. He didn't look around. He didn't assess the room, because everything he needed to know about this place had already reached him long ago through pages of reports. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his gray overcoat, drew out a black leather-bound ledger, and set it on the wooden counter, with a sound so soft it was almost polite. Yet that faint sound left Wade Mercer standing motionless, as though he had just heard stones tumbling at the edge of a cliff. His name was inside that ledger. So were the amounts he had borrowed from the Gallagher organization over the past several months to cover losses even he couldn't explain. Sums of money that seemed to vanish from the books as though leaking through the bottom of a rotting wooden barrel. Every one of them had been overdue for a long time. Mercer swallowed hard and opened his mouth to speak, but Ronan merely raised one finger, and the entire room fell silent. People often believed power lived in a shout. It didn't. Real power lived in the ability of one man to remain silent while the person before him lowered his head without being told. Mercer's shouting could force a widow to her knees on a tiled floor, but Ronan Gallagher's silence made Mercer himself want to kneel. Ronan sat at the table near the window, where the harbor cranes could be seen standing in black silhouette against a sky not yet touched by dawn, and spoke in a low, even voice that rose no higher than the wind outside. He wanted to see the restaurant's complete accounts. Revenue, expenses, every dollar that had entered or left the business during the past year. Mercer stammered that he needed time to prepare them, that the accountant hadn't arrived yet, that several documents were being kept at his house. Ronan didn't argue. He merely looked at the man with dark blue eyes, the color of the deepest sea, the gaze of someone who had heard thousands of excuses in his lifetime and no longer found any of them interesting, then said he would wait right there. And while he waited, he wanted breakfast. A bowl of clam chowder, provided the kitchen still remembered how to make anything decent. Mercer nearly ran into the kitchen. Behind the swinging doors, Cora had already risen to her feet. She had hurriedly rinsed the blood from her hands beneath a stream of bitterly cold water, dried them, and begun to cook as she had cooked every day since her husband passed, quietly, precisely, without a single unnecessary movement. She went down to the cellar for fresh clams. 12 steps. She counted them out of old habit, the habit of people who had nothing left to hold on to except numbers that stayed certain. 12 steps down, 12 steps up, 4 winters, thousands of mornings exactly the same. To count was to remain in control. To remain in control was to survive. The young kitchen assistant carried the bowl into the dining room, steam rising from it with the rich scent of butter, fresh cream, and the sea. Ronan lifted the spoon with the absent manner of a man eating breakfast, only because breakfast time had come. With the first spoonful, he stirred the soup gently. With the second, he brought it to his mouth, and then his whole body went still, like a ship brought to an abrupt halt by an anchor dropped in the middle of the current. That taste, the richness of the cream balanced by the faintest edge of acidity from white wine, the gentle warmth of spice at the back of the tongue, and a pinch of sea salt added at the final possible moment, causing every flavor to rise at once like a musical note struck precisely on the beat. It was the chowder from his father's little tavern, the flavor he had lost forever at 14 years old, along with everything his family had once possessed. Ronan lowered the spoon very slowly. For a long moment, he stared into the bowl as though it were a letter sent to him from the past. Then he looked up and asked who was cooking that morning. Mercer, who had been hovering nearby with his shoulders bent, immediately straightened his back and spread a greasy smile across his face. He said it was the restaurant's exclusive recipe, that he had personally selected and trained every cook in the kitchen, and that the refined palate of a man like Mr. Gallagher naturally couldn't be deceived. Ronan listened to every word without interrupting, and not a single line of his face changed. But his eyes had already passed through the lie as easily as a lighthouse beam cutting through thin harbor fog. A man who hurled a steel tray at someone kneeling on the floor could never have created a flavor like this. That taste hadn't come from selection or training. It had come from hands that had cooked with everything the heart could never put into words. He glanced toward the swinging kitchen doors, which had been left slightly open, and caught a glimpse of a thin woman with brown hair twisted into a bun and held in place by an old wooden clip. For the first time that morning, Ronan Gallagher understood that the debt he had come to collect was no longer the most important debt beneath that roof. That afternoon, while Mercer was still scrambling through the office gathering documents, beads of sweat shining on his forehead despite the bitter winter cold, Cora stepped out of the kitchen with a typed report in her hand. She had written it as carefully as she had written the previous 3, with the date clearly stated and every item laid out in precise order. The kitchen exhaust system had stopped working exactly 2 months earlier. The faint smell of scorching clung to the walls during every afternoon shift when all the burners were glowing at once. The electrical wires above the ceiling had grown so old that their insulation was beginning to turn brittle, like the skin of an elderly person, and the risk of an electrical fire hung over the heads of more than a dozen people who worked beneath them every day. She placed the paper on the desk in front of Mercer and kept her voice low and even. She told him respectfully that this was her 4th request, that all she was asking for was a maintenance crew to inspect the system for a single afternoon, and that the cost of repairing it now would be many times smaller than the price they would pay if the worst happened. Mercer didn't finish reading the first 3 lines. Perhaps the debt recorded in the black leather ledger outside was tightening around his throat. Perhaps the presence of the man in the gray overcoat in the dining room had left him needing someone beneath him on whom he could release his fear. He tore the report in half, then into quarters, right in front of the young kitchen assistant and the 2 workers who had been washing vegetables and now stood frozen in place. The white scraps fluttered down onto the tiled floor like ashes from a fire that hadn't yet had time to begin. He snarled that she was nothing, and had no right to tell him how to spend his money, that as long as she drew a paycheck from him, her job was to keep her mouth shut and cook. Cora said nothing. She bent down and picked up each torn piece with fingers still marked by deep cracks, and it was only when she straightened again that she realized the kitchen had fallen completely silent. Ronan Gallagher was standing in the frame of the swinging doors. No one knew how long he had been there. They only knew that his gaze didn't rest on Mercer for even a second, as though the man who had just been shouting wasn't worth noticing. Instead, it remained fixed on the woman standing in the middle of the room with a handful of torn paper. In a low, measured voice, he asked what she was in this place. The question settled into the silence of the kitchen, and Cora looked directly into those dark blue eyes. She didn't look away, just as she had stopped looking away many years ago, because she understood that lowering her eyes before a man only invited him to mistake silence for weakness. She answered that she was the reason this place hadn't burned to ashes. No one in the kitchen dared to breathe too loudly. Mercer opened his mouth to interrupt, but one glance from Ronan made him swallow the words before they could escape. Ronan studied Cora for another moment. There was no pity in his expression, and no curiosity. It was the look of a jeweler recognizing a genuine stone among an entire tray of glass. Then he turned and walked away without another word, leaving behind a kitchen that took a long time to recover the ordinary sounds of knives and cutting boards. Cora believed that was the end of it. But late that afternoon, just as the last of the daylight withdrew from the windows and she was preparing for the evening shift, a gray truck pulled sharply to a stop outside the restaurant's rear entrance. 4 workers in uniform climbed out carrying aluminum ladders, toolboxes, and rolls of brand-new electrical wire. Their supervisor handed her a work order and said briefly that they had been instructed to replace the entire exhaust system and rewire the ceiling, that the work would be finished before the night was over. and that every expense had already been paid in full. Cora looked down at the final line of the document, where the name of the paying company appeared, and saw the words Gallagher Holdings printed in bold beside a round official seal. She worked through the evening beneath the drilling and hammering overhead, and when the last worker folded his ladder and left, she stood alone in the kitchen and drew one deep breath. For the first time in 2 months, there was no smell of scorching. There was only the scent of new metal, freshly washed floors, and air so strangely clean that something tightened painfully inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't name, half gratitude and half suspicion. Years of working under that roof had taught her that nothing was ever given freely, and the larger the gift, the harder it was to predict the price attached to it. Before closing, she began wiping down the spice counter as she always did, and when she lifted the jar of sea salt to clean beneath it, her fingers touched a stiff card that had somehow been left there. The card was muted gray, without decoration, bearing only one sharply printed line. My kitchen in the North End pays a fair wage. No one pounds the tables. Cora stood motionless for a long time in the kitchen that no longer smelled of burning, the card resting in the calloused palm of her hand, as light as a scrap of paper, and as heavy as a door that had just opened a crack. That night, Cora carried the business card home to the apartment, with a single room at the bottom of the hill, where June was sleeping soundly at her grandmother's house because her mother's shift ended late. As Cora sat at the small wooden table beneath the yellow light, the long-buried memories suddenly found their way back, like the tide returning to the foot of a stone seawall. She remembered Daniel in the early mornings, the tall, slender man standing beside the stove, with a cloth towel draped over one shoulder, seasoning a pot of stock while whistling a tune without a name. The man who always said that cooking wasn't about putting spices into a pot, but about placing a part of your life inside it. He had a thick notebook bound in moss-green cloth, 200 pages long, where he wrote every recipe by hand in the kind of handwriting she could have recognized among 1,000 other pages, because every lowercase L he formed had a loop with a tiny opening that never closed completely, as though his hand couldn't bear to shut any door. She had teased him about it once, and he had laughed and said the door to their home should always remain open a crack, so she and their daughter would know the way back. She had believed their life would continue that way, drifting forward through the scent of lemon butter and the laughter of their little girl, until the night the ringing telephone tore through her sleep, the night the horizon above the warehouse by the harbor burned with a red glow. She would continue to see in her dreams for years afterward. They told her Daniel had gone back to the warehouse to retrieve some papers, that the fire had spread too quickly, and that by the time the fire engines arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. She stood among the crowd with her 1-year-old daughter in her arms, watching ashes fall like black snow, unable to cry, because some grief is greater than the body's capacity for tears. 3 weeks after the funeral, before the flowers on Daniel's grave had even finished wilting, Wade Mercer knocked on the door of their home, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a face carefully arranged into an expression of sorrow. He introduced himself as Daniel's investment partner, laid a thick stack of loan documents across the table, and explained in a voice as casual as someone discussing the weather that her husband had borrowed a very large sum of money while he was alive and had pledged the entire restaurant as collateral. He said everything was written plainly in black and white, that the harbor table now belonged to him, and that out of compassion, he was willing to employ her in the kitchen so a widowed mother and her child would have some money coming in. Cora turned to the final page of the documents, looked down at the signature bearing her husband's name, and felt the cold move through her body inch by inch. The handwriting looked terrifyingly like Daniel's, from the slant of the letters to the changing weight of each stroke, except for one detail that perhaps no one else in the world would ever have noticed. Every lowercase L in the signature formed a perfectly closed loop, smooth and complete, without the slightest opening. Her husband had never closed those doors. She took the documents to a law office downtown, sat in a hard chair, and told them everything. When she finished, the elderly attorney merely removed his glasses, wiped them slowly, and explained that a wife's feeling about her husband's handwriting wouldn't be accepted by a court as evidence. He told her that moving forward would require a forensic handwriting examination, costing the equivalent of 6 months of her rent, and that even after such an examination, the chances of a penniless widow defeating a businessman with fully notarized documents would be as fragile as a thread stretched tight in the sea wind. She went to the police, and they showed her a stamped final report. The warehouse fire had been caused by an electrical short. The case was closed. There was no evidence of a crime. Cora carried June out of the house that had once been their home, moved into an apartment with a single room overlooking a brick wall, accepted work in the very kitchen her husband had built, and learned to live with a stone lodged permanently inside her chest, something that didn't kill a person all at once, but forced her to feel its weight in every breath. Every morning she opened her eyes, and every time she heard another man praised by customers for dishes that carried Daniel's soul. That night, beneath the yellow light of the small apartment, Cora sat holding the muted gray business card for a very long time, long enough for the edge of the paper to grow warm from her hand. Then she rose, opened the drawer of the bedside cabinet, and took out an old tin box with chipped paint, where she kept the wooden hair clip her husband had given her soon after they were married, and a photograph of the three of them standing outside the restaurant on a sunny day. She placed the business card beside the wooden clip, gently, as though laying something she didn't yet dare to name, beside something she could never forget. And then she closed the lid. But for the first time in 4 winters, before she turned off the light and went to sleep, the widow didn't feel the stone inside her chest weighing as heavily as it did every other night. That Sunday was June's 5th birthday, and Cora traded shifts so she could be home by mid-afternoon. On the way, she stopped at the market and bought a bag of fresh pasta, a little over a pound of good butter, 2 yellow lemons with their leaves still attached, and 1 small apricot-colored candle. The dark apartment with its single room felt brighter and warmer than it did on ordinary days. Steam from the pasta pot clouded the window overlooking the brick wall, while June sat perched on a tall chair beside the kitchen table, wearing the red wool dress her grandmother had knitted for her. Her 2 braids were tied with bows that leaned to one side, and she kept asking, "Mommy, is it ready yet? Mommy, it smells so good," filling the little room with a kind of sound no elegant restaurant anywhere in the world could ever possess. Cora made lemon butter pasta, the family's favorite since the days when she was still a new bride. She heated the butter until it turned amber and released the warm fragrance of toasted nuts, then added the finely grated lemon zest at the exact moment the flame went out, allowing the oils to bloom without becoming bitter. When the glistening strands of pasta had been curled into the center of a deep plate, she lifted June into her arms so the little girl could add the final pinch of sea salt herself. Cora held her daughter's tiny hand inside her own and taught her to bring 3 fingers together, raise them a little higher, then release the white grains so they fell like the gentlest rain. "Remember," she told her, "the salt always comes last, and you sprinkle it from above." That was Daddy's note. Without it, the whole song isn't complete. June followed her instructions solemnly, with the concentration of a true artist, then blew out the apricot-colored candle standing in the middle of the pasta, while her mother applauded. When she lifted the first spoonful to her mouth, her round eyes lit up. She chewed slowly, nodding with an air of great importance, then looked up at her mother with a smile that showed the new baby tooth that had just come in, and asked in her clear little voice whether Daddy's flavor had tasted like this. Cora looked at her child, at the smile that resembled Daniel's down to the curve at the corners of her mouth, and smiled as she answered that it had tasted very much like this, exactly like this, except Daddy had been just a little better at sprinkling the salt from high above. Then mother and daughter laughed together, the child's laughter bright and crisp as sunlight breaking across water, and June declared that she would practice sprinkling salt every day until she was as good as Daddy, so that when she grew up, she could cook for her mother. That night, after the little girl had fallen sound asleep beneath the blankets with the red bows still tied around her braids, Cora remained alone at the kitchen table. She turned on the small lamp and took the moss-green cloth-bound notebook from the bottom of the cabinet. She opened each page slowly and traced her fingers over the handwritten lines that had faded with time, the names of dishes, the notes penciled into the margins. In one place, he had written to use less butter when the weather was cold. In another, he had drawn a tiny smiling face beside the lemon butter pasta and added the words, "The dish for my 2 girls." She sat there for a long time in silence, not reading so much as touching a hand through 200 pages of paper. At that same hour, on the other side of the city, high above the harbor buried in darkness, the light in Ronan Gallagher's office was still burning. He sat behind the broad stone desk with the copied financial records from the harbor table spread before him, and the farther he read, the straighter he sat. The numbers were telling a story they didn't know they carried. The restaurant wasn't failing at all. Its revenue was steady, its expenses were controlled, and every month should have left behind a substantial profit. Yet the money kept disappearing as though being poured into a barrel without a bottom. He traced every entry backward until he found it, a payment that returned with the regularity of the tide, appearing month after month beneath harmless names, such as consulting fees, management fees, and financial service charges, though every dollar flowed to the same destination, Vaughn Capital. Ronan lowered the reports and leaned back in his chair, staring at the scattered yellow lights along the docks. Wade Mercer hadn't borrowed money from the Gallagher organization because his business was losing money. He had borrowed it to feed a leech fastened to his back, a leech with a name, an address, and an official corporate seal. That meant whoever stood behind Vaughn Capital had been calmly draining the blood from Ronan's debtor all this time, which meant they had been draining Ronan's blood as well, inside a territory where even the wind was expected to ask permission before it passed through. Ronan reached out and switched off the desk lamp. In the darkness, only the city's glow remained against the glass, and in those deep sea blue eyes, a hunt had already begun. 3 days later, just as Cora removed her apron at the end of the evening shift and stepped into the alley behind the restaurant, she found a black car already waiting there, silent and gleaming beneath the streetlight, like a block of granite that knew how to be patient. The man standing beside it opened the rear door, bowed politely, and said simply that Mr. Gallagher wished to speak with Miss Ellison, that it would take only an hour of her time, and that the car would take her all the way home afterward. Cora stood still for several seconds in the cold night air, understanding that an invitation of this kind didn't truly come with an option to refuse, but also understanding that if the man intended her harm, he wouldn't have needed the courtesy. So she climbed into the car with her back straight and both hands resting on her knees, the way she had learned to face everything in life she couldn't predict. The car glided past rows of warehouses along the harbor and stopped before a gray stone building that rose far above every roof around it. From the moment the elevator doors opened, Cora began to see what she had previously known only through whispered stories. Along the stone corridor, broad-shouldered men in dark suits stood at evenly measured distances, and as she passed, each one lowered his head slightly, not to her, but to the guest of the man on the highest floor. Their silence was so orderly and absolute that every step of her worn heels sounded clearly against the stone. The office on the top floor was as vast as the nave of a church, with 3 walls of glass rising from the floor to the ceiling. Far below, the entire South Boston harbor stretched out like an enormous chessboard, its pieces formed by cranes, cargo ships, and towers of stacked containers. Everything blinking with light, and everything, she suddenly understood, operating beneath the hand of the man seated behind the black stone desk in the center of the room. Ronan Gallagher wasn't wearing his overcoat. He wore only a dark shirt with the sleeves turned back slightly, and a thick file lay before him. He invited her to sit without offering a single empty courtesy, then pushed the file across the stone surface toward her. He said his people had been investigating where the money from the restaurant where she worked kept disappearing, and while following that trail, they had uncovered something older and deeper, something connected directly to her. Cora opened the file, and her heart gave one hollow beat when she recognized copies of the same loan agreement bearing her husband's signature, the documents that had crushed her life 4 winters earlier. But this time, they were accompanied by pages she had never seen, internal circulation records showing that the entire agreement had been drafted, printed, and completed by a company called Vaughn Capital, not by any independent notary office as she had once been told. And there was something else, Ronan said, slowing over each word. She needed to look at the date written on the agreement. It had been backdated to nearly a year before the fire, which meant that on paper, her husband had signed it while he was still alive and well. That false date had been quietly strangling her in a way she had never known, because the law allowed a contract fraud claim to be filed only within a limited period, measured from the date shown on the document. As of that day, her window had only a few short months left before it closed forever. Cora raised her eyes from the page and asked the one question that mattered most. Why was he doing this? A man like him had no shortage of money, and no shortage of matters demanding his attention, while she had nothing to offer in return. Ronan remained silent for a moment, and turned toward the scattered lights along the harbor. Then, in the calm voice of a man describing a scar that had healed long ago, he said that when he was 14 years old, his father, an honest tavern owner who had worked hard all his life, signed papers he didn't fully understand, and those papers strangled him until his final breath. Because of that, Ronan had only one iron rule in this territory. He turned back and looked directly into her eyes. "I never help anyone for nothing, Miss Ellison," he said. "But when a man uses paper to steal another person's blood and sweat in this city, that becomes a private matter between him and me. Cora held his gaze without wavering and answered that she didn't need to be rescued. For the first time since they had met, she saw the corner of his mouth move slightly, almost into a smile, as he replied that he knew she would do it herself. He was only returning what had been hidden from her for 4 winters, and that was information. He rose, fastened his cuff, and added that the car would take her home, and if she decided to move forward, there was one name she should seek out before all others, a woman who trusted only documents, and who, for that very reason, could be trusted more than every promise in the city. Dana Whitlock's office occupied the 2nd floor of an old red brick building at the edge of downtown, above a bookstore that had long since closed. When Cora pushed open the wooden door bearing a brass plaque engraved with its owner's name, the first thing that met her was the smell of paper. Old paper, new paper, yellowed pages bound in leather, filling all 4 walls from floor to ceiling and leaving only a single window overlooking the rain-darkened street below. The woman seated behind a desk buried beneath files looked up. She was in her late 40s, with neatly cropped hair already threaded with a few strands of silver, steel-framed glasses resting squarely on the bridge of her nose, and eyes behind those lenses that regarded Cora in a way very few people ever had. There was no pity in them, no suspicion, only the simple recognition of one human being carrying a problem that needed to be solved. Dana Whitlock didn't offer tea or ask about the journey. She merely pointed to the chair across from her and said that she had exactly 1 free afternoon, so Cora should begin at the beginning, leave nothing out, and add nothing, because in her profession, embellished details could be even more dangerous than forgotten ones. Cora sat down and told her story. For the first time in 4 winters, she told the whole of it to a stranger. From the stack of loan documents that had appeared 3 weeks after the funeral, to the elderly attorney who had shaken his head and told her that a widow's instinct wasn't evidence, to the file the man from the harbor had recently placed in her hands, along with his warning that her window would remain open for only a few more months. Dana listened without interrupting, occasionally writing a few lines in a notebook with quick, sharp strokes. When Cora had finished, the woman removed her glasses, pressed 2 fingers gently against the bridge of her nose, and asked only one question. Apart from her knowledge of her husband's handwriting, had Cora brought anything written entirely by his own hand? Cora opened the cloth bag she had been holding tightly on her lap since the moment she entered, and took out the moss-green cloth-bound notebook. She placed it in the center of the desk, and said that it contained 200 pages written by her husband over nearly an entire lifetime spent in kitchens. Every recipe, every note, every penciled remark in the margins. Dana put her glasses back on, drew the notebook toward her, and began to turn the pages, slowly and meticulously, one after another, beneath the warm yellow light of the desk lamp. From time to time, she stopped for a long while at a particular page, running one finger along a line of handwriting, before moving on. The book-crowded room grew so quiet that Cora could hear the fine rain tapping against the window. The silence lasted long enough for her to prepare herself for another shake of the head, the second one in her life, from someone wearing a suit and sitting behind a desk. Then Dana looked up, removed her glasses, and held them in one hand. In the voice of someone who had just finished weighing something precious, she said that a signature could be forged. Miss Ellison, and forged very well, but no one in this world could forge 200 pages of a human life. She rested her palm on the notebook's cover as though laying it upon a stone used for taking oaths, then said that from that moment forward, the book wouldn't leave the safe in her office. She would bring in an independent document examiner, the finest one she knew on the East Coast, someone with no connection to any name appearing in the file, so that every conclusion reached would stand firm in court and leave no one able to break it apart. Cora asked softly whether there would be enough time when only a few months remained. Dana looked at her through the lenses and answered that a few months was very little time for a lawsuit, but a great deal of time for the truth, provided the truth was real. The next 3 weeks passed in quiet journeys between work shifts, authorization forms, specimen collections, and appointments. Then, on an afternoon when rain veiled the entire harbor, Dana called Cora back to the office, placed a forensic report before her that still smelled of fresh ink, and for the first time, Cora saw the woman who trusted paper smile. The examiner had studied every fiber of the paper and every particle of ink in the loan agreement, and discovered something the forger could never have anticipated. According to the manufacturer's own records, both the ink and the document stock used to create those papers hadn't entered the market until long after the date printed on the agreement. In other words, Dana said, speaking each word slowly, These documents have confessed that they were born after the date they claim. Someone moved the date backward to manufacture a past that never existed, and that supposedly clever deception has become the only exposed heel in the entire suit of armor. She folded the report closed, looked directly into Cora's eyes, and said that the lawsuit would be filed that week. From that day forward, the clock was no longer counting down against Cora. It had begun counting down against the man who had believed no one would ever dare question his papers. Not long after the lawsuit was filed, Dana Whitlock called Cora back to her office, and this time the desk buried beneath files held not one folder but 9, arranged in a neat row like 9 small stone markers. Dana said that when she traced the name Vaughn Capital through corporate registration records and old civil judgments gathering dust in the courthouse archives, she found a pattern repeated with such regularity that it sent a chill down the spine. 9 small businesses scattered across the city over nearly 10 years. A woodworking shop, a laundry, a flower store, a family restaurant, a boat repair yard, and 4 others, all sharing the same fate written in the same hand. The business owner died, some after serious illness, others in accidents, and then, only a few weeks after the funeral, before the family had even put away their mourning clothes, a complete set of loan documents bearing the dead person's signature would suddenly appear, every page in order, every official seal neatly placed. Their families, widows, and children, still stunned by grief, had neither the money, the strength, nor the knowledge to fight back, and one by one, they signed documents surrendering property their loved ones had spent a lifetime building. Dana tapped one finger against the thinnest file and said that this was the 10th case, unfolding at that very moment. It involved a small bakery in Dorchester. The owner had died only recently, and his gray-haired widow was already holding the first notice of foreclosure in her hands. Unless someone intervened, by spring, she would be standing on the sidewalk watching strangers remove the sign her husband had painted himself. Cora sat silently before the 9 files, feeling as though she were looking into 9 mirrors reflecting her own life. Then she noticed something that didn't fit. She asked Dana why the deaths in the other 9 cases had all resulted from clear illness or accident, while her husband alone had died in a fire, and why none of the others had dealt directly with Vaughn Capital before their deaths, while Daniel had. Dana nodded very slowly and said that was the same thorn she had just touched. The restaurant's old records contained traces, showing that while Daniel was alive, Vaughn Capital had approached him about financing an expansion and had held several meetings with him. That meant this vulture had always circled high above, waiting and sniffing out homes about to enter mourning before descending to tear away what remained. It had never dirtied its own claws by touching the prey, yet with Cora's husband, something appeared to have broken that pattern, as though Daniel had accidentally seen something he was never supposed to see. Dana stopped there and said no more. As a meticulous attorney, she never spoke beyond what was proven on paper. That same night, across the city, in an empty warehouse near the water where the waves struck the stone embankment in a steady rhythm, another conversation was taking place beneath the glare of a single high-powered lamp aimed directly at an iron chair in the center of the concrete floor. The warehouse manager responsible for row number 7 sat in that chair with both hands free. No one had touched him, yet sweat poured down his back and soaked through his shirt, because beyond the circle of light, Ronan Gallagher stood with his arms folded in the darkness, silent, and he had remained silent for so long that the silence itself had become the most terrifying interrogation the man had ever known. There was no threat, no raised finger, only the sound of the waves, the harsh light, and the deep sea blue eyes that occasionally flashed at the edge of the darkness. The warehouse manager began talking on his own. At first he offered denials, then his voice began to crack, and finally the words rushed out like water through a broken levee. He confessed that for nearly 2 years, shipments of documents that didn't match the official system records had passed regularly through his section of the warehouse. The bribe money had been transferred into an account opened under his cousin's name. Those shipments were connected to the flow of money from an outside credit fund whose name he had heard only in fragments, something called Vaughn. He admitted that he knew he was opening the rear door of the Gallagher warehouse system to outsiders. He knew exactly what he was doing, but he hadn't dared to stop. Ronan took one step into the edge of the light and asked the only question he had spoken all night. "Who gave you permission to open that door?" The warehouse manager swallowed hard, his eyes turning vacant, and stammered that he had only followed orders from someone above him. Then he lowered his head and didn't dare raise it again. Ronan remained still for another moment, then gave the faintest nod, as though the answer had already been expected. He signaled for his men to take the manager away and obtain a full statement, then walked outside the warehouse, where the sea wind swept hard between rows of dark containers. He stood there alone for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the financial district, where a name was waiting for him to come and settle the account. That morning, before the restaurant had opened, while the chairs were still turned upside down on the tables and the pale winter sunlight had reached only halfway across the dining room, Wade Mercer saw two people enter his office without knocking, the woman he was accustomed to commanding with shouts and the man to whom he owed more money than he could ever repay. They walked in side by side, and that image alone tightened his stomach with a terrible premonition. Cora placed a thick stack of documents on the desk before him, 9 files arranged neatly one atop another, and said in an even voice, neither loud nor soft, that he should sit down before he began reading, because his legs wouldn't be able to hold him once he saw what was inside. Mercer looked at the papers, then at the two of them, and did what men accustomed to shouting always did when fear took hold. He became angry. He slammed his palm against the wooden desk with a thunderous crack and roared that this was his office, his restaurant, that some dishwashing woman and anyone else had no right to storm in and play games with him, that he would call the police, fire her, and sue them both. No one answered. Ronan pulled out a chair and sat down at an unhurried pace, like a man waiting for a passing rainstorm to end, while Cora quietly opened the first file, turned it toward Mercer, and began reading each name aloud. The woodworking shop on Milton Street. Its owner died after a serious illness. 6 weeks later, loan documents appeared, and the property passed into the hands of a shell company. The laundry at the corner of Lower Avenue. Its owner died in an accident. 5 weeks later, loan documents appeared. The flower shop, the family restaurant, the boat repair yard. She read slowly and clearly, one case after another, and with every name, Mercer's shouting diminished another degree. The hand that had struck the desk gradually withdrew, and his fingers began gripping the edge of the wood. By the 7th file, he was no longer standing. He collapsed into the chair, and when Cora placed the final file before him, the thinnest one, concerning the bakery in Dorchester and the gray-haired widow holding a foreclosure notice in her hands, Wade Mercer's face, normally flushed red, had turned the color of cold ashes. Each sheet of paper seemed like a needle slowly drawing the blood from his skin. Only then did Ronan speak, his voice low and measured. He told Mercer to look again at his own accounts, at the nameless losses he had spent years convincing himself were bad luck or the ordinary cost of doing business, the payments that flowed into Vaughn Capital every month beneath respectable labels. That wasn't bad luck. It was a siphon. Mercer thought he was the owner sitting atop a vault of money, when in truth he was only temporary storage, a borrowed name used to hold the property until the real owner came to seize the rest. And that day, Ronan added in a slightly quieter voice, was drawing very near, as proven by the debt Mercer had taken from the Gallagher organization to fill those holes, a debt that had long since grown beyond his ability to repay. Mercer sat with his mouth opening and closing several times without producing a sound, his eyes shifting from the stack of files to Ronan and then to Cora, as though searching for someone who would tell him it was all a joke. When no one did, something inside the large, heavy man broke with an almost audible force. He sagged like a sack of flour whose bottom had been cut open, his shoulders collapsing, his head dropping toward his chest. For the first time in 4 winters, Cora heard his voice stripped of the volume of a superior man. All that remained was the faint rasp of someone who had just discovered that his entire life had been written by another person's hand. He began confessing without anyone questioning him, the words pouring out like water through a shattered dam. 4 winters earlier, he hadn't prepared any of the documents himself. One evening, someone had summoned him to the offices of Vaughn Capital and handed him the complete set of loan papers, already finished from beginning to end. The signature was there, the seals were there. All Mercer had to do was place his name on the transfer, take possession of the property, and remain silent. The man who had personally handed him the file that night was Vaughn's trusted chief accountant, a thin and secretive man named Emmett Boyd. Boyd had given him the papers with his own hands and instructed him, step by step, on exactly what to do. Mercer swore that he had believed, or more truthfully, had chosen to believe, that Daniel had truly borrowed the money, because believing it made sleeping at night easier. He stopped and swallowed hard, his fingers twisting together. then raised his eyes toward Cora with the look of a man daring for the first time to touch the deepest part of his own memory. His voice dropped until it was almost a whisper, as he said there was one more thing, something he had buried so deeply over the past 4 winters that he had forbidden himself even to think about it. Before Mercer left the office that night, Emmett Boyd had stopped him at the door, looked directly into his eyes, and given him one warning. If he wanted to enjoy his share in peace, he must never, ever ask anyone about the fire. The ink on Mercer's signed statement had barely dried when the first signs began to appear. They were small, but to a woman who had survived 4 winters by remaining watchful, small was enough. Toby, the 19-year-old kitchen assistant with honest eyes and a habit of speaking plainly that Cora valued more than every polished word, pulled her into a corner of the cellar at the end of the shift and lowered his voice. He told her that while collecting vegetables at the market that morning, he had seen a stranger in a wool coat casually asking the fish seller about her, where she usually went, whom she met, whether she often traveled downtown. The man had been subtle, but Toby had been standing close enough to hear every word, and he had answered for the fish seller that his head cook did nothing but go to work and return home. End of story. Cora thanked him and told him that if anyone else asked, he should give them exactly the same answer. Then she took her usual route home, and on the narrow street outside her building, she noticed a dark-colored car parked close to the curb. It had remained in the same place since the night before last, its windows dimmed, without any markings, sitting motionless like an eye that never blinked. She didn't panic. She had grown past the age of panic long ago. That weekend, she took June to stay with her grandmother as usual. The little girl carried a small gift, a new box of colored pencils, and skipped along the entire way while talking about her drawing class. When they said goodbye on the doorstep, fragrant with the smell of her grandmother's baking, June hooked her little finger around her mother's and made her promise that the following weekend they would go watch the boats at the harbor. Cora kissed her forehead and waved until the door closed behind the bright sound of her daughter's laughter. Then she remained on the sunlit porch for another moment, feeling her resolve settle firmly inside her. Because until everything was decided, the safest and happiest place for June was her grandmother's kitchen, warm with the scent of bread. Yet it was on the journey home alone that afternoon that Cora began to notice other shadows. A broad-shouldered man stood reading a newspaper at the corner where she turned, though he didn't change the page for 10 full minutes. Another sat in the coffee shop across from the bus stop where she always waited, though the coffee in his cup never seemed to grow any lower. They didn't stare at her. They didn't follow closely behind. They were simply there, steady and silent, like living markers placed along every road she traveled. Cora realized they didn't belong to the same people as the motionless car, because their eyes weren't hunting her. They were watching everything around her. She understood who had placed those markers there. The following evening, when the familiar black car arrived once more to take her to the gray stone building for a scheduled meeting about the case, Cora entered the glass office on the top floor and asked before she even sat down whether the men standing on the street corners near her home belonged to him and who had given him permission to do that. Ronan didn't deny it. He nodded and said that his men had been there since someone began asking questions about her at the market, and that he hadn't asked permission, because asking would have taken time. Cora looked directly into his eyes and spoke in a voice that was sharp and controlled. "Listen carefully," she said. "I'm grateful for the protection, but I have already spent 4 winters living beneath a man who decided everything over my head without asking me a single question. I swore I would never live another day that way, even if the hand making those decisions is a kind one. From now on, anything that concerns me must be discussed with me first." The room went silent for a moment. Then Ronan looked at her with the expression of a man who had been corrected and felt no insult in it. He said that she was right, that he was more accustomed to giving orders than asking questions, that it was a habit created by the chair he occupied. He promised that from then on, every decision touching her life would pass through her first. His men would remain where they were, but they would remain because she had agreed, not simply because he wanted them there. Cora nodded, and something was laid between them at that moment. Not obligation, but a boundary, the foundation upon which all genuine trust must be built. She returned home late that night and found an envelope from Dana Whitlock's office pushed through the mail slot. Inside was an old map of the harbor that Dana had copied from the archives, along with a note bearing only a few lines in her sharp handwriting. "Study the circled location carefully. The warehouse that burned all those years ago stood entirely within the area patrolled every night by the Gallagher organization, according to the duty records uncovered by one of my sources. On the exact night of the fire, the entire patrol assigned to that district was absent, without a single line explaining why. Cora stood in the middle of the small apartment, the map trembling faintly in her hands, and the ground beneath her feet, which had only recently begun to feel steady again, shifted by 1 degree. The map with its red circle had barely settled in Cora's mind when the next blow fell, swift and precise, as though the person striking it had eyes everywhere. That morning, she had only just stepped into the restaurant when she heard something shatter inside the office, and when she pushed the door open, she found Wade Mercer standing in the middle of the room with a white sheet of paper trembling in his hand, a glass cup broken across the floor at his feet, his face as pale as that of a man who had just looked into his own grave. It was an official notice from Vaughn Capital, its language cold and exact down to every comma, stating that because the borrower had remained in prolonged breach of his payment obligations, the entire balance of Wade Mercer's debt was now due immediately, with a final deadline of 3 days from the date of the notice. After that deadline, all pledged assets, including the harbor table and every piece of equipment, document, and financial record inside it, would be seized and sealed in accordance with the terms of the agreement. Mercer stammered that 3 days was impossible, that no one could raise that kind of money in 3 days, perhaps not even in 3 years, that it was over, they would carry everything away. He kept repeating the words, "It's over," again and again, like a drowning man repeating the final desperate motion of his arms. But Cora no longer heard him. She was looking through the notice toward what lay behind it, and the longer she looked, the straighter her spine became. Sealing the restaurant wasn't about recovering money. Vaughn knew perfectly well that Mercer could never repay that amount. Sealing the restaurant meant locking the doors of the scene. It meant that every original ledger, every stored document, every physical trace remaining from 4 winters of deception would be placed safely behind a seal, carrying the authority of law beyond anyone's reach until each item quietly disappeared. She set the notice on the desk and smoothed it flat with her palm, as though smoothing her own breathing, then spoke to Mercer in a voice that silenced his moaning, the voice of steel hardened in fire. "Look carefully," she said. "A calm man lays traps. A frightened man leaves footprints." For all these years, he sat still as stone because he believed no one would dare challenge his papers. Yet before the ink on my lawsuit has even dried, he suddenly demands the destruction of your entire livelihood within 3 days. No warning letter, no negotiation, none of the procedures he followed for nearly 10 years with those other 9 families. Do you understand what that means? It means he's afraid, and with this notice, he has signed his own name beneath his intentions. He has told the court with his own hand that he is rushing to bury something before anyone has time to dig it up. She took the notice and called Dana Whitlock's office at once. The woman who trusted paper interrupted before Cora had finished her 3rd sentence, her voice through the receiver as sharp as a paper knife. She told Cora to bring the document immediately, the original, without folding or creasing it, because this was no longer merely a foreclosure notice. It was evidence of an attempt to obstruct justice. Dana would prepare an emergency motion that very afternoon, asking the court to preserve the existing condition of the property and prohibit any seizure, removal, or destruction of assets or documents inside the restaurant until the lawsuit was resolved. Before ending the call, she added one more thing. "Miss Ellison, your enemy has just made his first mistake after years without making one. Men like that, once their footing slips, never stop after a single step." Those words followed Cora through the rest of the day, like a prophecy spoken under someone's breath, and they came true even faster than the attorney had expected. After nightfall, when the harbor lights had come on and the restaurant had closed, Ronan Gallagher received a report in his office, at the top of the gray stone building, from one of the guards he had stationed around the area days earlier. The message was brief, only a few sentences, but it was enough to bring him abruptly to his feet. A source among the men who handled nighttime work along the harbor had learned that someone was gathering a crew for an urgent job, offering generous pay and demanding absolute silence. The target was a waterfront restaurant that had to be cleaned out completely the following night, before some court order could take effect, and the words "cleaned out" were spoken in the particular way that everyone in that line of work understood, had nothing to do with wiping tables or sweeping floors. Ronan stood motionless beside the glass, looking down at the rows of dark rooftops along the water, where there was a kitchen, and where 4 winters earlier, someone had also wanted a warehouse cleaned out in precisely the same way. Afterward, the whole city had called it an accident. This time, he told himself, the fire wouldn't find a path inside. True to his promise about boundaries, the first thing Ronan did after receiving the warning was tell Cora what was happening. And so, the following night, after every light along the waterfront street had gone dark and mist from the water had begun crawling upward to coil around the sickly yellow street lamps, Cora sat inside the black car hidden behind the row of buildings across the street, a safe distance from the restaurant, looking through the tinted glass at the place where she had spent 4 winters on her knees scrubbing floors. Ronan sat in the front seat without speaking. The entire block appeared as empty and quiet as it did every other night, but she knew that within that emptiness, nearly 10 men from the Gallagher organization had already dissolved into the shadows before nightfall. One waited inside a recessed doorway, another crouched behind a large garbage container, another lay motionless in the loft of the neighboring warehouse, all of them still and patient as stones in a seawall waiting for the tide. They arrived sometime after midnight. An unlit cargo van crept into the alley behind the restaurant as silently as a catfish slipping through mud. 3 dark figures dressed in black stepped out, moving with practiced speed and precision. One took position at the entrance to the alley, while the other 2 approached the rear door. In the dim light reaching them from the farthest street lamp, Cora saw metal flash in the hand of the man in front as he fitted a pair of bolt cutters around the lock. A dry, clean snap broke the silence. The back door opened a crack, and all 3 slipped into the dark body of the restaurant, where the chairs remained turned upside down on the tables like a forest of wooden legs growing toward the floor. They moved directly toward their destination. They didn't search the cash register. They paid no attention to the safe. They turned toward the office and the kitchen, where the original records were kept, and one of them began running his hands along the spice shelf where her husband's recipe journal had once rested, unaware that it had been locked inside the safe of a law office for weeks. At that exact moment, the darkness inside the restaurant moved. The shapes that had remained still among the rows of tables suddenly separated themselves from the shadows and closed into a circle that had been waiting around the intruders all along. Everything happened so swiftly and cleanly that it produced almost no sound. One arm was twisted behind a man's back and locked in place. Another body was forced face down against the wooden floor. The third man managed to run 3 steps before 2 walls of human shoulders blocked his path and drove him to his knees in the middle of the aisle. There were a few brief sounds of struggle, chairs scraping sideways, breaths coming hard and fast, and then it was over. The restaurant returned to a darkness so cold and orderly that it seemed nothing had ever happened. The 3 intruders were held firmly where they had fallen, unable to move. The backpack belonging to the leader was placed neatly on the floor and opened, revealing 2 plastic containers filled with gasoline and a carefully wrapped bundle of fire starters. The leader of the ambush team stepped forward and quietly asked for instructions through his radio. Everyone waited for the order that was usually given in their world. Take all 3 down to the docks and let them learn the law of the harbor. Instead, Ronan's voice came through the radio, slow and clear, each word distinct. No one was to lay another finger on them. The scene was to remain exactly as it was. The evidence was to remain untouched. All 3 men were to stay in the precise places where they were kneeling. Then they were to call the police immediately and report that intruders had been caught in the act. Silence held the other end of the radio for several beats. The team leader had to ask Ronan to repeat himself because he believed he had heard wrong. In all his years serving beneath Gallagher, no one had ever heard the boss of the docks voluntarily invite the police into his affairs. But Ronan merely repeated the order, shorter and sharper this time, while his eyes remained fixed on the restaurant, where the headlights of patrol cars soon began sweeping brightly across the street. The police followed procedure. The 3 intruders were handcuffed and read their rights. Every piece of evidence was photographed, numbered, and sealed beneath the flashes of police cameras. The 2 gasoline containers, the bundle of fire starters, the bolt cutters, and more valuable than all the rest, a telephone found in the leader's coat pocket. The instructions were still there, not yet deleted, written in the brief language of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The address, what they were supposed to find, how they were to leave. And the sending number, as one investigator remarked while making a quick check, was registered to a security employee of Vaughn Capital. Cora sat behind the car's darkened glass, listening to each report come through, and felt a coldness travel the length of her spine that had nothing to do with the night mist. She watched the 2 gasoline containers being carried outside beneath the lights. She thought of the way those 3 shadows had walked directly toward the records, as though they already knew the restaurant by heart. Inside her mind, 4 winters began unwinding backward toward the red glow that had burned against the horizon, toward the words "electrical short" stamped across an official report, toward the warning that no one should ever ask about the fire. Every piece slid into alignment, like train cars joining one after another, and the truth appeared before her with a clarity that chilled her to the bone. The night that had taken Daniel from her had begun exactly like this one, with shadows like these, with gasoline containers like these. The only difference was that on that night, no one had been waiting in the darkness to stop them. The car carried Cora away from the street while the lights of the patrol vehicles were still sweeping across the wet pavement. And throughout the entire ride, she didn't say a word. Her hands remained tightly clasped in her lap, because inside her chest, two currents were crashing against each other, one flowing from the truth that had just taken shape about the night Daniel was taken from her, the other from the map with the red circle still lying in a drawer at home. The map showing that the warehouse that burned all those years ago stood entirely within the patrol territory of the Gallagher organization, and that on that exact night, the whole patrol team had been absent without a single line explaining why. The car stopped outside her building. Ronan stepped out and opened the door, and perhaps he intended to say something about increasing the number of men around her neighborhood beginning the next morning, but he never had the chance. Cora stopped in the middle of the empty sidewalk, turned to face him beneath the streetlight, and everything she had held down throughout the night burst free in a question as cold as a blade left out in the mist. "Answer me one thing," she said. "The night my husband died, where were your men?" Ronan went still. She stepped closer, and her voice didn't rise. It dropped lower, and because it did, every word fell with the weight of stone. "That warehouse stood on your ground, beneath your eyes. Your patrol passed it every night for years. Yet on that one fateful night, every one of them disappeared without explanation, leaving 3 shadows carrying gasoline to walk inside as though the place belonged to no one. I saw tonight how smoothly they did it. I saw how practiced they were. So tell me how I'm supposed to understand that. Did your men look the other way? Were they paid to turn their backs? Or was it something worse?" She paused, and her final words came down like the closing stroke of a blade. "You and Vaughn speak the same language, the language of power, of orders that don't require explanation, of people who disappear and files that receive official seals. There is only one difference between the two of you. You haven't used that language against me yet." The night mist drifted between them. Ronan didn't argue, not because he had no words, for this was a man who had never lacked words when they were needed, but because the moment Cora mentioned the patrol team, a cold fracture had opened inside him as well. He knew better than anyone that no Gallagher patrol abandoned its position for even a single night without authorization. To remove an entire team from its route required a deployment order, a signature, and someone willing to accept responsibility, which meant that if the warehouse district had been left unguarded that night, the breach hadn't come from beyond his walls. It had come from inside them. He looked at the woman standing before him, at 4 winters of pain holding itself upright and demanding an answer, and he could say only one thing, very softly: "I don't have an answer for you yet, but I swear I will." Then he lowered his head in farewell, turned, and walked back toward the car, his gray overcoat dissolving into the mist like a question that hadn't yet been resolved. The lights in the top-floor office of the gray stone building remained on until morning. Ronan had the internal records manager dragged from his bed, ordered the archives opened, and began the most merciless inquiry the Gallagher organization had witnessed since the day it was founded. Merciless, not because of whips or fists, but because nothing was allowed to escape examination. Every patrol ledger from 4 winters earlier was carried upstairs and spread across the black stone desk. Every assignment sheet, every deployment order, every signature marking the beginning and end of a shift. Ronan turned each page with his own hands beneath the desk lamp, comparing dates, routes, and names, and the men who stood around the room that night would later say they had never seen their leader remain silent for so long, or appear so frightening. Near dawn, he found it. A thin deployment order tucked between yellowed pages, dated on the exact day the entire city would later remember as the day of the accident. Its contents were brief and perfectly valid. The entire patrol team assigned to the waterfront warehouses had been ordered to reinforce a loading site on the opposite side of the harbor because of concerns over cargo security, an instruction that no one at the time would have had any reason to question. At the bottom of the page, in the space reserved for the person issuing the order, was a signature Ronan recognized from the very first stroke, a signature he had seen thousands of times on thousands of documents, the signature of the only man in the organization who had the authority to move men without seeking Ronan's approval. The man who had stood beside him when they had nothing. The man who, many years earlier on a rain-soaked night at the docks, had thrown his own body in front of a bullet meant for Ronan. Ronan's hand tightened around the deployment order. Slowly, one fraction at a time, until his knuckles turned white beneath the desk lamp, and beyond the glass, the harbor lights began to blur in the first light of morning. The man's name was Colm Brennan, the right hand of the Gallagher organization, the only person permitted to enter Ronan's office without being announced, the man who had risen beside him from the days when they were two harbor children sharing a loaf of cold bread, and the man every member of the organization called Uncle Colm, with all the reverence reserved for a living legend. Ronan summoned him to Warehouse Row 7 late that afternoon, when the sea wind had begun slipping through the gaps in the metal walls and making them shriek in long, mournful bursts. When Brennan stepped inside and saw Ronan standing alone in the vast emptiness of the warehouse, with a single sheet of paper resting on a wooden crate between them, he stopped on his very first step, because old wolves can smell the approach of their final day faster than anyone. Ronan didn't shout. He didn't ask a question. In the voice of a man who had spent the entire night awake beside patrol ledgers, he simply said, "Look at this deployment order, Uncle, your signature, your date. Give me one reason, only one, strong enough that I won't have to believe what I've believed since just before dawn." The sea wind moved through the silence between the two men, and Colm Brennan, who had never lowered his head before the barrel of a gun, slowly sat on the edge of the wooden crate like a man whose spine had been pulled from his body. The broad hands that had protected Ronan throughout his youth were now clasped together and trembling. He confessed without evasion and without begging, in the hoarse voice of a man who had spent 4 winters waiting for this moment. It had begun with gambling, a weakness he had hidden from the entire organization beneath his disciplined appearance. Small losses became larger ones. The larger losses became a debt no recognizable name in their world dared to collect, until one day, an elegant man named Preston Vaughn came to him, purchased every note of debt in a single afternoon, and placed 2 paths before him. Either the Gallagher organization learned everything and Brennan lost his honor, his position, and all he had built, or he occasionally performed a few small favors, signed a few papers, and opened a few doors. And he had opened them, Brennan said, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. He had ordered the manager of Warehouse Row 7 to close his eyes while Vaughn's document shipments passed through the Gallagher warehouse system for nearly 2 years, turning the Gallagher docks into a conduit for dirty money that no one could trace. He was the man above him whose name the warehouse manager hadn't dared to speak. 4 winters earlier, when Vaughn asked him to remove the entire patrol team from the waterfront warehouses for one night, claiming that his men only needed to retrieve a few sensitive documents, Brennan had signed the order without asking another question, because asking more meant knowing more, and knowing more meant carrying more. When the horizon above the warehouse turned red, and they carried out a man who would never return home again, Brennan finally understood what he had opened the door for. But by then, it was too late. From that night forward, Vaughn no longer held only Brennan's debt. Vaughn held his life, and only recently, Brennan himself had told Vaughn about the recipe notebook and the original records inside the restaurant, guiding the 3 shadows and their gasoline cans toward the building the night before. When he finished, he raised his head and spoke the final words of his life within the organization. "Whatever punishment you choose, I'll accept it. I ask you to believe only one thing. The night I signed that order, I didn't know anyone was going to die." Ronan stood motionless for a long time, and the anger inside him was unlike any anger he had ever known. It wasn't hot. It was cold and deep, like the bottom of the harbor in winter, because he had finally reached the lowest layer of the truth. For 4 winters, the hand of the Gallagher organization, the hand he had built so no one could ever again use paper to steal the sweat and labor of the poor, had been borrowed by another man to shield the very crime that had once destroyed his father. And in that moment, he fully understood the look in Cora's eyes beneath the streetlight that night. He understood why she had looked at him as though she were looking at Vaughn, because from the floor, where people were forced to kneel, every form of power cast the same shadow. The only thing that could distinguish Ronan from the other man wasn't his oath. It was what he chose to do next. That night, the entire organization held its breath, waiting for the judgment demanded by the law of the docks. A law no one spoke aloud, but everyone knew. Ronan stepped in front of his old brother, looked directly into eyes faded by guilt, and spoke each word slowly. "Years ago at the docks, you took a bullet meant for me. Today, I repay you with your life. From this moment on, I owe you nothing. Before the sun rises, you will leave this city forever. You will take one suitcase and nothing more. And if there is anything about Vaughn that you know, you will write down every word, sign your name, and leave it here in place of an apology." Colin Brennan nodded, rose to his feet, and walked past Ronan without daring to touch his shoulder. His shadow gradually disappeared beyond the warehouse door amid the shrieking of the sea wind through the metal walls, leaving the younger man standing alone in the hollow building, still holding the old deployment order. Only one thought remained in his mind. Things had to be different. Beginning that day, his power would have to learn how to become something else. News that the 3 intruders had been caught in the act, along with a telephone that pointed directly to Vaughn Capital, spread through the city's business circles like oil drifting across still water. Perhaps it was that spreading stain that drove a man to Dana Whitlock's office on that gray afternoon at the end of the week, while Cora sat beside the attorney reviewing every page of the case file. The knock at the door was very soft. 3 separate taps, as though the person outside had to gather all his courage before making each one. When the door opened, a thin man stood there in an old coat that had been pressed with a kind of pitiful care. He hadn't yet reached 60, but nearly all his hair had turned white. His eyes were deeply sunken, the eyes of someone who had forgotten what a full night of sleep felt like, and both hands held a thick paper envelope against his chest. He looked at Dana, then at Cora, and when his gaze met the widow's, his narrow shoulders trembled faintly. In a voice barely louder than wind slipping through a crack beneath a door, he said, "My name is Emmett Boyd. I was the chief accountant at Vaughn Capital, and I believe you know who I am." Cora remained motionless. The name Mercer had spoken on the morning of his collapse now stood before her in flesh and blood, smaller and more broken than anything she had ever imagined when she pictured the man whose pen had written disaster into her life. Boyd didn't wait to be offered a seat. Perhaps he feared that if he stopped for even a moment, he would no longer have the strength to continue. He stepped forward, placed the envelope on the desk, and drew out a thick stack of handwritten pages covered in dense lines of ink. Every page had been carefully numbered, and every paragraph had been arranged in neat lines according to the lifelong habits of a man who kept accounts. "This is my statement," he said. "I have been writing it for 4 winters. I wrote it, then burned it, then wrote it again. This time, I finished it and brought it here." Then, standing in the middle of that room crowded with books, he began to speak in the steady voice of a man, reading aloud the sentence passed upon himself. 4 winters earlier, he had personally traced Daniel Ellison's signature onto the loan agreement, copying it from the genuine signature sample Vaughn had given him. With his own hands, he had completed every page of the documents Mercer later carried to Cora's door. Then he admitted something he hadn't dared write down during all those 4 winters, until he reached the final page of his statement. While tracing the signature, his trained eye had noticed a distinctive feature in the dead man's handwriting that the sample couldn't reproduce. He had seen it. His hand had stopped for several seconds. Then he had lowered his head and continued copying. For money, for fear, for countless reasons, none of which could remain standing when night fell. He had intended to carry the secret into his grave, but the week before, he learned that Vaughn was preparing the next set of documents, this time targeting the small bakery in Dorchester, belonging to an elderly woman whose husband had only recently died. From that day on, every time Boyd closed his eyes, he heard paper rustling, the tip of a pen scraping across the page, the sound of his own hand 4 winters earlier. He couldn't endure another night. For the first time since crossing the threshold, Emmett Boyd raised his head and looked directly into Cora's eyes. Then he spoke the sentence he had surely rehearsed again and again throughout the journey there. "Miss Ellison, I haven't come to ask for your forgiveness. I have no right to ask for that. I only ask that you allow me to put this down where it belongs." The room remained silent for a long time, with only the fine rain touching the window. Cora looked at the white-haired man standing before her and waiting for judgment. She felt none of the hatred she had imagined for so many years would rise inside her. There was only an immense weariness, and a clarity more immense still. She spoke slowly, every word hardening like salt into crystal. "You owe my husband the truth. If you want to repay that debt, repay it in court. Don't repay me. Your tears can't change anything in this room. But there, your testimony can save an old woman's bakery and restore the name of a man who has been laid to rest." Boyd bowed his head so deeply that it seemed he wanted to fold his entire body down to the floor. and Dana Whitlock stepped forward to receive the statement with both hands, as though accepting something that weighed 1,000 pounds. In the days that followed, the machinery of the woman who trusted paper never stopped turning. A subpoena was sent to Frank Osgood, the elderly notary who had placed his official seal on the documents all those years earlier. Confronted with the evidence arranged across the desk, he trembled and admitted that he had applied the seal at Vaughn Capital's request without examining the documents, comparing the signatures, or ever meeting the person who was supposed to have signed them. By the end of that week, the cards bearing the witnesses' names had been arranged across the wooden board in Dana's office, forming a closed arc around a single name placed alone at the center. Dana took one step back and studied the entire arc, then spoke to Cora, in the calmest voice Cora had ever heard. "The frame is closed. Now we drive in the nails." After everything that had happened, Dana wanted to review every piece of evidence one more time before the court date. And so, on an evening early that week, Cora sat in the book-crowded office, with the moss-green cloth-bound notebook taken from the safe, wearing thin cotton gloves as she turned each page beneath the desk lamp at the attorney's request, searching for any note, number, or name they might have overlooked. She had read that notebook 1,000 times in her life, and knew every stain, every crossed-out line. Yet that night, when she reached the final page, her hand suddenly stopped. The last page contained a dish she had never paid much attention to, because it came after several blank pages, as though it had been written separately from everything else. At the top, carefully lettered in dark ink, were the words, "A dish for the day June turns 18, followed by a list of ingredients." But the cook in Cora recognized at once that something was wrong. No chef in the world would combine those things. Star anise and cinnamon stood beside cod, heavy cream beside grape vinegar, while the quantities were jumbled and meaningless. Daniel, who had cherished every recipe as tenderly as he cherished his daughter, would never have written a ruined dish as a gift for the most important day of the girl's life, unless it wasn't a dish at all. Cora sat upright, her heart pounding, took out paper and a pen, and began doing something she and Daniel had played together when they were first in love, a kitchen word puzzle he had adored. She wrote down the first letter of each ingredient in the exact order they appeared, placing them one beneath another on the empty lines, and the letters slowly joined to form a name, the name of an old bank on Summer Street, followed by a string of numbers hidden inside the meaningless measurements. Dana looked over her shoulder and remained silent for several seconds before reaching for the telephone and calling a contact at the bank that very night. The following morning, carrying the inheritance documents Dana had prepared in haste, Cora passed through the heavy bronze doors of the bank on Summer Street and walked between 2 rows of stone columns to the underground vault, where the elderly manager examined every document before leading her into a cool steel room. He placed a safe deposit box coated with the dust of time on the table, and the bank's records showed that only one person had ever been registered to it or opened it, Daniel Ellison, the final time only a short while before the fire. Cora lifted the lid with hands that were no longer steady. Inside, arranged as neatly as everything Daniel had ever done in his life, lay the original investment agreement, containing the genuine terms and signatures between him and Vaughn Capital, the document proving that he had never borrowed a single dollar from anyone. Beneath it was a thick bundle of papers tied with coarse twine, copies of financial records and pages crowded with his familiar handwriting, in which Daniel had traced and recorded every irregularity he had accidentally discovered during his meetings with the credit firm, names, streams of money, documents bearing the signatures of dead people in other transactions. Her husband had seen the vulture long before it ever had the chance to descend upon his own life. At the very bottom of the box, set apart inside a white envelope bearing only the name Cora, was the letter. She opened it in the silence of the steel room, and his handwriting, with its familiar open loops, appeared beneath the light. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. Don't cry for too long, Cora. Keep cooking. My flavor is already in your hands." That was all. For 4 winters, she hadn't shed a single tear. But now, deep inside the cold bank vault, the widow pressed the letter against her chest and wept like rain that had been imprisoned for far too long. She made no sound, but her shoulders trembled in waves, because while she had believed all those years that she was fighting alone, the man she loved had always remained one step ahead of her, still reaching out to protect her and their daughter from beyond death. When she stepped out of the bank, the winter sunlight lay pale across the street, and Ronan was waiting beside the black car, keeping the careful distance of a man who knew he hadn't yet been forgiven. Cora walked directly toward him. She said nothing about the night beneath the streetlight. She merely held out the letter with both hands, and the most powerful man on the harbor received it with both of his. He read it slowly, taking far longer than the few lines required, and when he finally raised his head, something in those deep-sea blue eyes had settled forever. He offered no defense. He opened the car door, removed a thick sealed file, and placed it beside the letter in her hands. "This is everything my world uncovered," he said. "The warehouse manager's testimony, the handwritten statement of the man who once served as my right hand, every name, every shipment. From today forward, it belongs to your attorney and to the court. I promised you an answer, and I have chosen to answer the way your husband did, in black and white, beneath the light." At dawn on the day the trial was set to begin, fog rose from the bay so thickly that the high harbor lights had become nothing more than dull halos suspended in the air. Through that fog, the car carrying Emmett Boyd pulled away from the small boarding house where he had been temporarily placed during the days before his testimony. The driver was an employee of Dana's law office, and the route had been planned with care. They left long before the courthouse opened in order to avoid any possibility of trouble. But hunters knew how to plan as well. The car had barely left the residential streets and entered the deserted road running along the edge of the harbor when two dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles quietly separated themselves from the fog at two intersecting streets. One closed in from behind, the other moved ahead and began pressing inward from the side. There were no horns, no flashing lights, only pressure, patient and cold, gradually forcing the smaller car away from the main road and driving it onto a side route that led directly toward an abandoned container yard at the far end of the harbor, where the fog lay dense between towers of stacked steel boxes, rising like cliffs, beyond the sight of every watchful eye in the city. The driver from the law office went pale and reached for the telephone. In the back seat, Emmett Boyd clutched the leather case containing his written statement tightly against his chest. The white-haired old man understood immediately what was happening. He understood that in this game, he was the easiest piece to sweep from the board. If the witness disappeared, the entire frame would collapse. He closed his eyes and prayed, not for himself, but for the testimony he hadn't yet been able to give. The smaller car was forced deep into the center of the yard. The two dark vehicles separated and blocked the entrance completely. 4 men stepped out and advanced in a line, their shoes grinding against the damp concrete. At that exact moment, beams of light burst on together from within the fog, between the rows of steel containers. 3 black cars had been waiting there all along, positioned across the road ahead like a wall rising out of the mist. From the narrow spaces between the containers, tall figures stepped silently into view, neither rushing nor shouting, closing into an arc around the 4 men with the discipline of people who had arranged the battlefield before the prey had even begun setting its trap. From the day Boyd entered the law office, Ronan had ordered his men to follow the old man from a distance, along every route he traveled, so discreetly that Boyd himself had never known. The air in the container yard tightened like a ship's mooring cable before a rising tide. The 4 men stopped inside the circle. Every hand drifted toward a waistband, but no one dared draw anything, because they were counting, and the count told them they had already lost. They were outnumbered. They had lost the ground. They had lost even to the name standing behind those black cars. Then the fog ahead opened, and Ronan Gallagher walked forward, his gray overcoat darkened by moisture, each footstep sounding evenly against the concrete in the absolute silence. He stopped several paces from the men blocking the road, looked across each face attempting to hide behind a raised collar, and spoke without raising his voice, though every word carried clearly through the fog. "I'm giving you a choice about what you lose. Your car keys, or everything Vaughn hasn't had time to pay you yet." The words fell into the container yard and remained there for several long seconds, like a tide holding still. The 4 men looked at one another, then at the silent ring surrounding them, then at the man to whom the entire harbor belonged. A dry metallic sound struck the concrete. One set of keys, followed by another, landed on the damp ground. The 4 shadows slowly backed away, turned, and disappeared into the fog near the gate, with the steps of men who understood that they had just been spared in a place where mercy wasn't supposed to exist. Gallagher's men collected the keys, recorded the license plates of both vehicles so the information could be given to the police, then cleared the way for the smaller car to return to the main road. For the remainder of the journey to the courthouse, the 3 black cars maintained an escort formation in front and behind, silent as 3 moving blocks of stone. By the time the car stopped at the courthouse's stone steps, sunlight had begun breaking through the fog. Emmett Boyd stepped out, straightened himself, and drew a long breath of morning air. The leather case remained clasped tightly against his chest. His elderly hands were still trembling slightly, but when he looked up at the words carved above the stone archway and the heavy wooden doors opening before him, the eyes hollowed by 4 winters without sleep no longer turned toward the ground. They looked straight ahead, and the man carrying his guilt climbed the steps one at a time, walking toward the place where he would finally set down the burden of his life where it belonged. The courtroom was packed when the trial began, and Preston Vaughn sat at the defense table in a gray suit without a single crease, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly into place, his face bearing the composure of a man who had passed through many rooms like this one without ever leaving anything of himself behind. Beside him sat one of the financial world's most celebrated attorneys, with a perfectly squared stack of files and the eyes of a hunting bird. Dana Whitlock opened not with soaring rhetoric, but with sequence, the weapon she trusted most. And the first person to take the witness stand was the document examiner, a middle-aged man who spoke slowly, as though reading the results of precise measurements. On the large screen, he displayed the 200 pages of the moss-green cloth-bound notebook beside the signature on the loan agreement, enlarging each letter and leading the entire courtroom through 200 pages written by one human hand over the course of a lifetime. He pointed out the small but persistent pattern that repeated itself year after year in the dead man's handwriting, then placed it beside the smooth, fully closed letters on the agreement, and concluded in an even voice that the probability of the same hand producing both sets of writing was so low that it could be excluded. He then turned to the materials and presented the manufacturer's own records, confirming that the ink and paper stock used to create the agreement hadn't entered the market until long after the date printed on the documents. In other words, those sheets of paper had confessed that they were born after the day they claimed as their own. And from the rear of the courtroom, the reporters' pens began scratching like a sudden rainstorm sweeping across a metal roof. Then, Emmett Boyd took the witness stand. His elderly fingers were still trembling when he placed them upon the Bible, but when he began to speak, his voice no longer shook. He testified to everything, receiving the genuine signature sample directly from Preston Vaughn, tracing it with his own hand onto every page of the agreement, recognizing through his trained eye the distinctive feature in the dead man's handwriting, and lowering his head to continue copying anyway, and even the warning he himself had given Wade Mercer at the office doorway all those years ago, ordering him never to ask about the fire. Each statement fell into the courtroom like another stone set into the foundation of a house. Next came Frank Osgood, the elderly notary, who admitted that he had placed his seal on the documents at Vaughn Capital's request without examining them, comparing the signatures, or ever meeting the person who was said to have signed them. Finally came Wade Mercer, the man whose name had benefited from the fraud for 4 winters. He described the evening when he received the complete set of documents, already prepared from beginning to end. When Vaughn's attorney pressed him, asking why he had remained silent for all those years if he had truly harbored doubts, Mercer sat quietly for a long time before raising his head and answering in the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Because believing that paper gave me an entire restaurant," he said, "while doubting it would have forced me to look into the face of the woman I made kneel and scrub a floor that rightfully belonged to her husband. Your Honor, silence has always been the easier bargain to swallow." The courtroom sank into a silence so complete that the soft crackling of the heater in the corner could be heard. The case had tilted decisively to one side, and everyone in the room could feel it. Perhaps that was exactly why Vaughn's attorney chose that moment to rise, fasten the button of his suit jacket, and reveal the move he had concealed since the beginning of the trial. He didn't challenge the examiner. He didn't touch Boyd or Osgood. Instead, he turned fully toward the plaintiff's table, aimed his spear directly at it, and spoke in a voice smooth as silk. "Your Honor, the defense doesn't dispute the differences between the handwriting in the notebook and the signature on the agreement. The defense merely asks the court to consider the opposite possibility, that the forged item isn't the signature on the agreement, but the notebook itself. Who, we must ask, possessed that notebook for 4 winters, without independent verification? The plaintiff, who knew every recipe, every habit of the dead man's hand, better than anyone else in this world. Again, the plaintiff, a highly skilled cook with exceptionally capable hands, 4 uninterrupted winters of time, and the greatest motive imaginable, the recovery of an entire restaurant. Your Honor, 200 pages could easily have been copied one by one, year by year, by a wife patient enough to manufacture her own evidence. Murmurs erupted across the rows of seats like waves striking the hull of a ship. The judge had to strike the gavel repeatedly and call for order. Cora sat at the center of that storm, listening as the thief called her a thief in the most expensive language money could buy in the city. Once again, she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 4 winters on her knees, 200 pages left behind by her husband. All of it was being turned inside out and sharpened into a blade pressed against her own throat. In the row behind her, Ronan Gallagher sat as still as stone, his hands clasped so tightly that every knuckle had turned white. The man who could set the entire harbor in motion with a single nod could only remain seated, because he had promised her that in this battle, the law would carry the sword. At the plaintiff's table, Dana Whitlock slowly removed her steel-framed glasses and polished the lenses with a cloth, calm as though she had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. Dana Whitlock put her glasses back on and rose while the echo of the accusation still hung in the courtroom. She didn't answer with emotion or raise her voice. She simply asked the court for permission to introduce an additional group of exhibits, then signaled for her assistant to bring forward a safe deposit box that had been sealed in full accordance with legal procedure. As she began to speak, the entire room settled into silence with the slow, measured rhythm of her words. "Your Honor," she said, "the defense has just proposed that the plaintiff spent 4 winters copying 200 pages in order to manufacture evidence for herself. The plaintiff will answer that theory with something no wife, no cook, and no skilled hand in this world could ever forge, time recorded by a third party with no connection to anyone in this courtroom." She placed before the judge the official record documenting the opening of the safe deposit box at the bank on Summer Street, witnessed by a bank representative and an independent notary, along with a complete certified copy of the vault access ledger the bank had preserved under strict control through successive generations of management. Then she read aloud the lines of faded ink for the entire courtroom to hear. The safe deposit box had been rented and registered in the name of one person only, Daniel Ellison. He was the only person who had ever opened it, a total of 3 times, and the final entry had been recorded only a short while before the night the waterfront warehouse burned. From that day until the lawful heir opened it through proper legal procedure, the box had never been touched. That meant everything inside had been placed there and locked away by the deceased while he was still alive. No one, including the plaintiff, could have added or removed even a single sheet of paper. Dana then presented each item recovered from the box, one by one, the original and genuine investment agreement between Daniel Ellison and Vaughn Capital, proving that he had never borrowed a single dollar. The bundle of documents tied with coarse twine, in which the cook had recorded in his own hand the irregularities he discovered involving files bearing the signatures of deceased people in other transactions conducted by the credit firm. The names and streams of money matched with chilling precision the 9 case files the plaintiff had introduced at the beginning of the trial. Finally, Dana presented an envelope that had been numbered as evidence, the letter a husband had left for his wife. She didn't read it aloud. She said only that its contents were already part of the record, and then added, "Your Honor, the defense has asked who can testify on behalf of the plaintiff. Here he is. That witness has been sitting in this courtroom since the trial began. He simply needed 4 winters before he could be heard." The courtroom fell utterly silent, and within that silence, it seemed possible to hear the calm final words of a voice no longer present in this world, speaking through each page passed from hand to hand among the jurors. Vaughn's attorney rose to object and glanced down at his client, waiting for a nod, but Preston Vaughn didn't move. He sat as still as a wax figure, his eyes fixed on the bundle tied with coarse twine, as though he had just seen the ghost of the man he believed had been silenced forever. The final blow followed immediately when Dana submitted the police report concerning the 3 intruders caught in the act, together with the lawfully extracted messages containing their instructions, an electronic chain leading directly from the scene to Vaughn Capital. When closing arguments ended and the judge began reading the ruling, each sentence rang clearly beneath the high ceiling. The loan agreement bearing Daniel Ellison's name was declared entirely void because it had been created through fraud. Every transfer of property arising from it was therefore without legal effect. The harbor table, together with all assets attached to it, was ordered returned to Daniel Ellison's lawful heir. In light of the newly discovered evidence, the court also referred the entire file concerning the waterfront warehouse fire to the prosecutor's office for the reopening of a criminal investigation. There in the courtroom, law enforcement officers approached the defense table. Preston Vaughn didn't move until the cold steel of the handcuffs closed around his wrists. Only then did the shoulders beneath his perfectly pressed gray suit sink for the briefest moment, long enough for everyone in the room to see. Cora remained seated at the plaintiff's table, amid the sounds erupting around her. Chairs scraping, people calling her name, reporters rushing toward the doors, but all of it reached her as distant echoes from beyond a wall of water. The only sound she could hear clearly was her own blood roaring through her temples like a tide reversing direction after 4 winters of standing still. She didn't know when she had risen. She didn't know who had placed a coat around her shoulders. She knew only that, somewhere inside that vast dizziness, her right hand was being held firmly inside another hand, warm and steady as a stone seawall. That hand didn't pull her anywhere. It simply remained there, holding her until the ground beneath her feet became level again. Several months later, on an early spring morning when the sunlight had begun to warm the surface of the harbor, a new sign was hung above the restaurant entrance, dark blue paint over solid oak, with carefully lettered gold words that read, "Daniels, the Harbor Table." Passers-by stopped to admire it, not only because the sign was beautiful, but because the story behind it had traveled by word of mouth throughout the city during the winter just past. Inside, the dining room glowed, with sunlight pouring through freshly cleaned windows. Toby now served as the head cook for the morning shift, wearing a spotless white chef's coat and earning such a fair wage that he still looked embarrassed each time he received it. At the new pastry counter beside the window, the silver-haired widow from Dorchester arranged fragrant apple pies across the shelves. Her bakery had been preserved intact after the ruling, and when Cora invited her to bring her craft beneath the same roof, the elderly woman had held Cora's hands for a long time without being able to form a complete sentence. Letters from the 9 families arrived one after another throughout those months. Some were 3 pages long, while others contained only a few unevenly written lines, telling her that the deeds to their workshops had been returned, that their father's signs had been hung once more. Cora placed every letter inside the old tin box beside the wooden hairclip, and her husband's letter, because things with weight belonged together. That Sunday afternoon, the restaurant closed early for a private family meal. June stood on the tall chair beside the stove, her 2 braids tied with yellow ribbons, her round eyes following every movement as her mother tossed glistening strands of pasta in butter fragrant with toasted nuts. When the plate was ready, Cora lifted her daughter so the little girl could bring 3 fingers together and sprinkle the final pinch of sea salt from high above. The tiny white grains fell like the gentlest rain. June took her first spoonful, chewed very slowly and solemnly, then suddenly looked up at her mother, her eyes shining as though sunlight lived inside them, and cried out that she could taste Daddy's flavor, that she truly could. Cora stood motionless in her husband's kitchen, looking at her daughter's radiant smile and the streak of butter at the corner of her mouth. For the first time in 4 winters, tears rolled down Cora's cheeks without carrying the salt of grief. They fell because she felt warm, because she felt full, because at last this kitchen was filled with laughter again, just as the man she loved had always hoped it would be. At the corner table beside the window, where a small reserved card would forever bear his name, Ronan Gallagher sat in a simple gray sweater instead of his overcoat, a bowl of steaming clam chowder before him. He watched mother and daughter beside the stove and smiled softly. The man who had once made an entire harbor hold its breath had learned something no form of power could ever teach, that the strongest hand wasn't the one that forced another person to lower their head, but the one that helped the powerless stand upright again. And he was learning how to use his own hands in that truest sense, a little more each day, beginning at the corner table of a restaurant beside the harbor. Cora Ellison's story ends here, but its lessons remain with every one of us. Justice may arrive late, but it won't remain absent if we are brave enough to stand and seek it. The pain of loss never disappears completely, but when we dare to rebuild our lives upon its ruins, that pain can become the strongest foundation beneath our home. And the worth of a human being isn't measured by whether they are kneeling on the floor or standing upon a high platform, but by whether they have refused to lose themselves. If today's story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue discovering more compelling stories together each day. How did this story make you feel? And which moment moved you most deeply? Please tell us in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments. May you and your family always enjoy good health, joyful lives, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.